This Sunday on Capital Connection, Speaker Madigan off the hook, at least for now.
This is stonewalling. This is ostrich in the sand decision-making. This is pretending there's not very damaging information out there.
House Republicans beside themselves in an uproar after the top Democrat chairing the House Special Investigative Committee says the Madigan hearings are on hold until after the election. Plus, our feature interview with Senator Tammy Duckworth.
Mitch McConnell could actually start the move back towards bipartisanship by not shoving through this nominee at this point in time.
Where she stands on President Trump's pick for the Supreme Court, the future of the makeup of the Supreme Court, and might she serve in a Biden administration? It's all coming up on Capital Connection.
From the Illinois State Capitol Rotunda, Capitol Bureau Chief Mark Maxwell is asking the tough questions. This is Capital Connection.
Welcome to Capital Connection. I'm Mark Maxwell reporting from the Illinois State House on this Sunday, October 11. The presidential election is 3 weeks from Tuesday. Can you believe it? It's almost here already. And that, the election, looming large on the calendar, was the reason that House Democrat Chris Welch announced abruptly this week he would be canceling or postponing all of the House Special Investigative Committee's hearings examining and investigating Speaker Madigan's connection or possible links to the ComEd corruption case.
This is how a political professional covers up the truth and crushes an investigation. If you want to get to the truth of the matter, you issue subpoenas and you move. You don't delay. But it's very clear that the Speaker is very afraid of two little words, and those are under oath, and followed up by under penalty of perjury.
If these allegations of wrongdoing by the Speaker are true, there is no question that he will have betrayed the public trust and he must resign. Those are all statements made by Governor Pritzker in July. Here we are now in the first week of October, and he still does not have the answers.
And when we come back, our feature interview this week with Senator Tammy Duckworth. She was once considered a potential candidate, a possible running mate to join the ticket with Joe Biden. Of course, it didn't go that way, but she has emerged in recent weeks as a continuing and vocal critic of President Trump. What she thinks about the future of the Supreme Court, next.
Help keep Champaign County safe.
New numbers of COVID-19 cases can be decreased across the country.
As individuals, wearing a mask is something that each of us can do
to help reduce the spread of COVID-19. Do it for the people you love and the people around you.
So please wear a mask, indoors and outdoors, and when social distancing is not possible.
We need to work together. Wear it, don't share it.
Running a restaurant is hard work, but I'm proud of what we've built. Last year, we served over 100,000 meals, brewed lots of beer, and supported a dozen Illinois farms. Then the pandemic hit us hard. Now we're cooking again, thanks to Senator Dick Durbin. He helped secure emergency loans for small businesses like ours. And our 43 employees are back to work.
This round's on me. I'm Dick Durbin, and I approve this message.
This may surprise you, but I am not a billionaire.
I'm not a billionaire.
I am not a billionaire.
But billionaires are spending a fortune running ads to fool you about the fair tax.
The truth is, the fair tax will help small business owners like me.
And farmers like me.
And seniors like me.
But the fair tax will finally make millionaires and billionaires pay their fair share.
So they will stop at nothing to fool you.
It's time for change. Vote yes for fairness.
Is your sidewalk or driveway settled? Seal-tight insulation and slab jacking is the answer. Locally owned and operated, we use polyurethane, the most advanced and successful slab jacking system available to lift your concrete. And we offer a lifetime guarantee. Raise it right with Seal-tight.
Is your credit score getting in the way of things you want to do? Personal loans through NetCredit help you borrow up to $10,000. So check your eligibility on netcredit.com today without affecting your credit score. You may even be able to build your credit history as you repay. NetCredit, a more personal loan.
When a junior senator from Illinois was running for president and needed some foreign policy expertise to add experience and gravitas to the ticket, Barack Obama tapped Joe Biden. 12 years later, when the 77-year-old Biden needed someone younger, a rising star in the party, someone with real-world, battle-tested experience outside the white-collar comforts of lawyerly life in the Senate, he looked long and hard at another junior senator from Illinois, this time Tammy Duckworth. Biden would ultimately settle on a different running mate, California Senator Kamala Harris. But Duckworth, a Purple Heart combat veteran, emerged as one of Biden's most loyal supporters, offering her endorsement of the former vice president and her scathing rebuke of the current president on a national stage at the Democratic National Convention in August.
Joe Biden understands these sacrifices because he's made them himself. When his son Beau deployed to Iraq, his burden was also shouldered by his family. Joe knows the fear military families live because he's felt that dread of never knowing if your deployed loved one is safe. He understands their bravery because he has had to muster that same strength every hour of every day Beau was overseas. That's the kind of leader our service members deserve. One who understands the risks they face and who would actually protect them by doing his job as commander-in-chief. Instead, they have a coward-in-chief who won't stand up to Vladimir Putin, read his daily intelligence briefings, or even publicly admonish adversaries for reportedly putting bounties on our troops' heads.
And Senator Tammy Duckworth joins us now remotely from Washington, D.C. Senator, you've been a very vocal critic of President Trump for not speaking out or, in your words, publicly admonishing Vladimir Putin for reports that Russia put bounties on the heads of American soldiers. What would scolding Putin actually accomplish? Is it words you want to see from President Trump or actions?
Well, I want to see several things. One, he needs to confront Putin, and he needs to do it in a public way so that it sends the message to anybody around the world that you do not do this with American servicemen and women and that we will not stand for it. And second, I have wanted the Department of Defense to begin an investigation into seeing whether any of the last 18 months woundings and deaths of American men and women in Afghanistan can be linked to one of these payments. And when I've asked both the Department of the Army and the Department of Defense if they've done that, their answer has been no. They've not conducted an investigation. You know, and I have Gold Star family members who've lost children in this time period. And I've talked to a Gold Star mom who said this. You know, she says, "Listen, it's been a year since I lost my son. I see this. I want to know if there was a bounty put on his head." And so I would like to see that investigation. They've not done that. And the President of the United States is the commander-in-chief of the military. He needs to send a very clear message to the troops under his command that he will stand up and protect them, that he will do everything that he can to safeguard them. Because when you have the duty of the commander-in-chief, you know, you have the responsibility for both caring for, safeguarding, but training and equipping the men and women in our military. It means that you must stand up for their well-being because someday you're going to ask them to go into battle for us. And you can't do that if you're going to roll over and let Vladimir Putin put bounties on their heads.
If American military or intelligence does establish incontrovertible evidence that links those bounties to the death of American soldiers, what would be an appropriate response? Would you view that as an act of war?
Well, I don't know that I would call it an act of war, but certainly there have been several proposals written in the Senate that would increase sanctions against Russia. We would also need to talk to our allies that are also in Afghanistan because bounties may have been put on their troops' heads as well. But certainly we would need to elevate the situation. I wouldn't say right now whether it's an act of war or not, but I would at least like to establish whether or not this actually happened. And the Senate and members of the Senate have actually already written legislation that would impose sanctions on Russia should this be the case.
Back here in the U.S., we saw some alarming news reports this week on Thursday from the FBI revealing that they had intercepted a terrorist militia group that was plotting to capture the Democratic governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer.
The FBI and Michigan State Police arrested 6 individuals charged in a federal complaint with conspiring to kidnap the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer.
Just last week, the President of the United States stood before the American people and refused to condemn white supremacists and hate groups like these two Michigan militia groups. Stand back and stand by, he told them. Stand back and stand by. Hate groups heard the President's words not as a rebuke, but as a rallying cry, as a call to action. When our leaders speak, their words matter. They carry weight. When our leaders meet with, encourage, or fraternize with domestic terrorists, they legitimize their actions.
The FBI says those violent extremists used terms like tyranny and treason as they discussed carrying out their plot. Of course, during the coronavirus closures early on in the spring, President Trump previously had tweeted, quote, "Liberate Michigan." He called Governor Whitmer the lockup queen, in his words, saying she's locked it up. She's got people like living in prison. Do you see any connection between President Trump's words or his rhetoric and the actions of that terrorist militia group?
Well, I think overall you've seen the rise in racism and racist attacks across this country ever since President Trump became president. We've seen an increase, exponential increase in attacks against Asian Americans, for example, and he himself has refused to condemn white supremacist groups, whether it was in Charlottesville or even recently on the debate stage when he refused to condemn the Proud Boys. So I do see the president as having influenced the rhetoric. I've not seen the evidence from the FBI to see whether there's direct linkages between the president and these terrorist groups, but certainly the president has created an environment in this country that has been very divisive and has actually, been one that has allowed these groups, these white supremacist groups, to continue to grow. And by the way, on the debate stage, he talked about asking armed militia to come and intimidate people at the polls, under the guise of being poll watchers, for crying out loud.
All right, we're going to have to go to a quick break, but when we come back, more with Senator Tammy Duckworth.
When you need to know what the weather will be in the coming week, tune in to WCIA3's 7-day forecast. You can count on our team of meteorologists, Kevin Livey, Jack Durfin, and Amelia Henderson, for the most accurate 7-day forecast. Sponsored by Edelman.
You want to make an impact on the world, caring for others by being a great nurse. Call us today and schedule a private tour of Lakeview. Lakeview College believes you deserve personalized guidance and an individualized educational plan suited to your goals in a safe and local environment. Get the guidance you need today. Because now, more than ever, the world needs you.
Springfield politicians, they promise they won't tax retirement income if their constitutional amendment passes, but their measure lets them increase income taxes on every group of taxpayers, including retirees. Even our state treasurer said so publicly. The truth is, nothing in the constitutional amendment protects retirement income from being taxed. So, we could trust the politicians to be fair to taxpayers or vote no.
I'm Betsy Dirksen-Londrigan, and I approve this message.
Scandals and special favors. Rodney Davis, another Illinois politician out for himself. The ComEd scandal. Davis took $64,000 from the CEO, executives, and PAC of a company that admitted bribery to keep rates high. The PPP loan debacle. Davis's family got to the front of the line for $1 million payout, and he voted to keep it secret, while businesses and families suffered. Rodney Davis. He wins, we lose.
I would recommend Beltone hearing aids to any of my family or friends. I have recommended them to a couple different people who ended up buying Beltone, and they were very satisfied with their Beltone hearing aids. One of the things I like about my new Beltone hearing aids is the fact that I can control them with my phone. I can adjust the volumes between each individual ear or together, set settings for restaurants. The Bluetooth app on them works great. I can hear them in my tractor. I can hear them in my combine. Clarity is just very good.
CashNetUSA.com, man. I help when money's tight.
If approved, you may get the money you need as soon as the same business day. Get the cash you need fast. Apply online today. Go to CashNetUSA.com.
Money's on the way with CashNet USA.
We're back now with Senator Tammy Duckworth. Senator, last month we saw a video of you and your two daughters laying wreaths and flowers near the steps of the Supreme Court, paying your respects to the memory of late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
The very reason I could be a United States Senator is because of RBG. And what she did for women's rights, and I'm sorry. My girls are the product of in vitro fertilization and her protection of a woman's right to make decisions about her own body meant that I could use IVF to conceive my girl. And if personhood amendments and those kinds of laws pass, then we couldn't have IVF and I wouldn't have these two girls. We're all Americans and we all deserve to have our say, and this is the safeguard of a democracy. And so, you know, I spend my life defending our democracy, and to think that it could be in jeopardy because of a grab for power is just not acceptable.
And Vice President Biden has used the battlefield at Gettysburg as a backdrop against which to paint the vision of his campaign for the country, of course evoking the bitterness of a civil war time in our country. Speaking of another controversial topic, the Supreme Court, we saw video images of you and your daughters laying flowers at the steps of the Supreme Court, paying respects, of course, to the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It sounds like you're already decided on how you'll vote on the confirmation against Judge Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. But do you have any way, do you have any opening or any arguments strong enough to stop her confirmation?
Well, I don't think that anything that Democrats do is going to matter because Mitch McConnell is actually on an absolute power grab to basically pack the Supreme Court. He is not taking any Democratic input. And they're going to try to have this vote even before the election. By the way, contrary to what most Americans want, I believe the last polling said that 70% of Americans believe that the winner of the presidential election should be who nominates the next Supreme Court justice to fill Ruth Bader Ginsburg's seat. And, you know, listen, to push a nominee through with not an adequate check into their backgrounds. And we just found this Guardian article where she failed to disclose that she supported this group that says that life begins at the fertilization of an egg, and doctors who perform IVF should be criminalized. She didn't disclose her support of that group. I think that we're doing a real injustice to the American people that Mitch McConnell would push this nominee through this quickly without adequate vetting, without adequate questioning. I've not had a chance to meet with her. She's not going to sit down with me or many of the other Democratic senators. So this is all Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans at this point.
We've heard similar arguments from Senator Schumer, calling this a power grab, as you just did.
President Trump's nominee for this vacancy will receive a vote on the floor of the Senate.
Leader McConnell has defiled the Senate like no one in this generation. And Leader McConnell may very well destroy it.
They want to pack the court.
If Leader McConnell presses forward, the Republican majority will have stolen 2 Supreme Court seats. If my friends on the Republican side want that kind of Senate, they can follow Leader McConnell down the very dangerous path he has laid down.
They want to pack the Supreme Court.
Everything is on the table. My Senate Democratic colleagues and candidates know America needs some change. And we're going to figure out the best way to do it.
How strongly you feel. Vote now. Make sure you, in fact, let people know you're a senator. I'm not going to answer the question.
Why would you answer that question?
The question is,
radical left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen,
You'll know my opinion on court packing when the election is over. Now, look, I know it's a great question, and I don't blame you for asking.
He said, though, that could open the door to Democrats packing the court, expanding the Supreme Court from 9 justices perhaps up to 15, or eliminating the filibuster, or even adding new Senate seats from Washington, D.C., or from Puerto Rico. How would you describe any of those moves as anything other than power grabs?
Well, now listen, you can't just add Senate seats from D.C. and Puerto Rico without those becoming states. And so I've long supported Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. becoming states, if that's what the people of Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. want to be. They're Americans who are disenfranchised in that they're not allowed to vote in certain elections, and that's simply unfair. Washington, D.C. in particular. So listen, I think that we need to get to a place where we can work in a bipartisan way, and we need to do better for the American people. And what we have right now is Mitch McConnell, who has taken so many of the rules and procedures of the Senate and completely broken them irrevocably. We have a president who's trying to shove through a nominee that is not one that the American people support. And so, I would have to say everything is on the table as far as I'm concerned.
Including packing the court.
Including packing the court? I mean, including expanding the number of justices on the Supreme Court? Sure.
Do you worry, though, that pushes in you just mentioned the return to bipartisanship. Wouldn't a move like that, even if you can argue that, Senator McConnell's positions justify that sort of tit-for-tat approach, doesn't that move in the opposite direction of the path toward compromise?
Let me just say that this is not a tit-for-tat approach. I'm going to reject your premise because for me, it's about the well-being of the American people. Mitch McConnell could actually start the move back towards bipartisanship by not shoving through this nominee at this point in time. We could actually have a real series of Senate hearings and go back to the 60 vote margin in order to confirm a Supreme Court justice. He could start honoring blue slips, which he has stopped honoring in the last several years. There's all sorts of things that he can do as the current leader of the Senate, and he chooses not to do that. I'm worried about the American people. I am worried about November 10th, when the Supreme Court is set to hear a case that will take away potentially health care from 20 million Americans and take away protections for pre-existing conditions. So I will do whatever I can to make sure that we safeguard Americans' health care, that we safeguard the well-being of people with pre-existing conditions, and that they have those protections, that we don't go back to a time when insurance companies decide whether or not you get coverage for your illnesses. That's my primary priority right now.
During the primary race, Vice President Biden said he would not support packing the court. More recently, he has avoided that question altogether. I assume you're probably familiar with much of his thinking, being in close concert with their campaign in recent months. Do you have any insight into, obviously it takes an act of Congress to change that structure, but should Vice President Biden tell the American people before Election Day whether or not he supports that idea of expanding the size of the Supreme Court?
Well, I think what needs to be done right now is Mitch McConnell needs to pull down this nominee and say we're not going to have a vote on this nominee until next year, and that the winner of the election on November 3rd is the person who should be nominating the next justice of the Supreme Court. This is, after all, the McConnell policy when he rejected Merrick Garland, who was nominated 10 months before the election. And so if you want to solve the situation, it can be done very easily. If Mitch McConnell would pull down this nominee and say, we're just not going to have this hearing, we're not going to have this vote until next year, then that solves the situation that we're in.
I guess what incentivizes Republicans to do that? They have the votes. Where do you draw the line? How many months before an election? Where is it where you'd be comfortable saying, is it once votes have already been cast? Is it once the conventions have wrapped up? Where's the line that says, okay, at this point, we're no longer going to touch the Supreme Court?
Well, this is the irony of this whole thing. This is Chuck Grassley and Mitch McConnell who came up with this concept with Merrick Garland. Nobody had ever heard of this before. You would actually have a Supreme Court nominee would be nominated, and they would go through a months-long process of vetting and meetings and hearings before you actually got to the point where you would have a vote, and then you would take a 60-vote margin to confirm someone to the Supreme Court. And that's why we have Supreme Court justices who are confirmed with 90 votes, 97 votes, essentially a complete majority of the United States Senate. It was Mitch McConnell and Chuck Grassley who themselves came up with this crazy, idea that, okay, we're not going to even have a hearing on someone who's nominated in the last year of a president's term. So why is he not even sticking to his own policy that he created himself? with this nominee that he used against Merrick Garland.
Yeah, it's the hypocrisy argument you're making. Vice President Biden obviously thought highly enough of you to consider you a close candidate for a potential running mate. I wonder, and maybe a lot of voters in Illinois wonder as well, would you consider accepting an offer from Vice President Biden to serve in a Biden administration, or would you prefer to stay as an Illinois senator?
Well, my first love is the Senate. I've always wanted to serve in the Senate. I have not been made an offer by Vice President Biden. I will tell you, though, that, some girls fall for the drummer in the band. I fall for the line, your country needs you to serve. And so I keep saying yes. So I don't know. I've not been made the offer. I will tell you that I love being a United States Senator from Illinois. I have so much more work that I want to do in the Senate. Many bills that I've written that I would love to be able to submit and have voted on, especially we have Democratic control that would help make the lives of working families and working mothers so much better. And so I hope to be able to do that. And that's the path that I'm staying on. But, the drummer in the band is always kind of the cute guy anyway, right? So you never know.
Well, Senator, I have to ask the follow-up question. Who is your favorite drummer?
I don't have a favorite drummer. That's my point. I'm not the one that falls with the drummer in the band. I fall for the your country needs you to serve line.
All right, Senator Duckworth, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be right back.
The billionaires are spending a fortune to try and scare us. They want to keep getting away without paying their fair share. I did my research, and here are the facts. The fair tax will not tax retirement income. You heard that right. The fair tax will not tax retirement income. As a matter of fact, 97% of Illinoisans will get a tax cut, including seniors like me. It's time for change. Vote yes for fairness.
Stay warm and cozy like these dogs this winter. Let your friends at Dogtown Heating, Air, and Plumbing install a new Lennox home comfort system for you. We offer special financing and 0% interest for 60 months on all Lennox systems. Call us today and ask about all the ways we can help take care of the indoor air quality in your home. Dogtown Heating, Air, and Plumbing, your home's best friend.
Betsy Londrigan is lying to you.
I have not taken any money from Speaker Madigan.
The truth is, Madigan spent nearly $300,000 to elect Londrigan. Londrigan also takes money from corporate lobbyists, even Big Pharma, breaking her promise not to accept corporate dollars. And those negative ads against Rodney Davis, paid for by corporate cash. A Madigan machine politician, Betsy Londrigan is lying to get elected.
I'm Rodney Davis, and I approve this message.
When the pandemic had us down, Rodney Davis stood up for us, ensuring American manufacturers and workers could expand production of protective equipment, disinfectants, and other critical life-saving products. Illinois manufacturers are proud of the role that we've played during these challenging times and thank Rodney Davis for protecting our families and frontline workers. Call Congressman Davis and thank him for his leadership during this crisis. American Chemistry Council is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Let's get started. What are we making? Chicken roll up.
Kids Cooking School rules.
You should be making a mess in your kitchen. Have fun.
With a hot diggity dog dish by Danielle Cardis.
I love my chili with vegetables.
And a giant nacho that's good for big kids, too.
You excited, honey?
I can't even tell you how much. Plus, the hilarious Jane Lynch.
Who's your furry buddy? Oh, look, she looked up.
Next, Rachel.
Monday at 3 on WCIA 3.
That does it for us this week. Thank you for joining us. We hope you'll be right back here at the same time next Sunday. For Capital Connection, I'm Mark Maxwell.